Hello, I'm Bob the Bookerer and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk a bit about the books that I've been reading this week. It's a little bits of sort of some fun reading in amongst everything. Booker reading is still very much dominating things. So these are kind of books that I've managed to eke out in the edges around that. But I've still very much enjoyed these. So let's get talking a little bit about these books. So first up, this novel, Separate Rooms by Pier, Vittorio, Tondelli, and translated by Simon Pleasance. And this is a book that was sort of hidden for a little while and has had a renaissance this year. So essentially it was published in Italian in the 80s, I believe, and recently translated into English. I'm not sure if there had been an English translation before, but at least this is sort of bringing the book back in. It's sort of a new version of the book. And it is interesting that that has been the case because it's a novel where a lot of what happens also happens in London. And so there's something quite nice to have almost an outsider perspective, but of very well-known gay places in London and particularly around Soho. And so there's something quite interesting for me, at least, of knowing these places that the authors are talking about, but this being a time before I would have been going there. And so this sort of window into something, but particularly during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And that's a big part of what is happening in this novel. So we are there with two characters, principally. Thomas, who is a young German man who is slowly dying, and we're having some barks, and Leo, who is his lover, who is slightly older. He's a writer and he's sort of going through the world, but neither of them are from the UK, and Leo is Italian. And so we kind of get this outsider perspective, particularly on London, but on various other places, as these two men sort of move through the world. But what particularly happens is Leo cannot bear the idea of watching Thomas die. And so he embarks on little trips where he just keeps moving and keeps going, almost at the hope that he will be able to outrun it or will be able to ignore it for long enough that he doesn't have to deal with it. And I found the moments of that really beautifully done in this book. It's so deeply sad in talking about some of those aspects. And particularly we have scenes of him in bars or clubs feeling utterly alone because he doesn't feel like he can go and flirt with people or be around people because he's thinking about Thomas, but he also can't really bear the idea of going back home to Thomas. He feels like he has to be in this third space of something where he can keep himself occupied, but not feel like he's being drawn towards some other route. So it's a really beautiful book. And the separate rooms of the title, I think, kind of allude to both that idea of separateness, but also the very undercover ways that people would have had to live. Though I will say there's something so interesting for me about this book that was a real breath of fresh air, which is often when you read older, particularly gay novels, there is something about having to be in really hidden spaces, which is kind of, the reality for many people at the time. But this book has so many moments of really liberating and freeing and relaxed and joyous sort of sex and relationships and free conversation and all these other things that felt really beautiful to have. This idea that actually we often think about it as just through the lens of the bad times, and actually there's all this other joyousness and community and whatever else happening at the same time. So yeah, I found this a really beautiful book. It kind of gripped me a lot more than I was expecting, and I particularly thought that it handles that so well and is such an interesting time capsule into that moment as well. I thought it was a really beautiful book, if quite a heavy one at times as well. Next up, I read, please excuse my pronunciation on this, Pathemata by Maggie Nelson, and with the subtitle, The Story of My Mouth. So essentially, this is a very short book, about 60-70 pages. Maggie Nelson, who I really enjoy reading, I find her thoughts on things so interesting, writes in this book largely about her jaw, and she has a lot of issues around her jaw. She has really bad jaw ache, and it comes with many other things off that. So the amount of pain that she's in means that she is so consumed with thinking about her jaw, thinking about moving through the world, thinking about how she's going to eat, thinking about whatever else, whether there's a cure, how she can recover, all those sorts of things. So much so that it occupies a lot of her other thoughts and doesn't really allow for much else. But then at the same time, there's something else going on in this book about a wider discussion of health and its place and how we think about ourselves and about life, and how meaning is derived through that, and the ways that our sense of self and our identity is portrayed outwards. So she will be on panels and people will be thinking, well, this is Maggie Nelson, and in her head she's thinking, well, I'm just thinking about my jaw. And it's a book that is just really interesting, particularly the way it talks about kind of closeness and intimacy, because she's so preoccupied with thinking about her jaw that she can't really feel close to people. She's watching as there are difficult moments in her marriage, where the kind of openness of the marriage is proving tricky for her, because she doesn't feel like she's able to do any kind of reciprocation. She doesn't really feel that she's able to be fully present because of her jaw. And so she's watching as all this other stuff's happening. It's surprisingly interesting for a book about a jaw. I found it really... There's something about the way Maggie Nelson writes of sort of pulling together 3 or 4 threads. I think either Bluey or Bluets, I don't know how you pronounce it, by her, or The Argonauts were stronger books personally for me, but I still really enjoyed what this book has to say. And it's such a short read that I think it's still something very interesting to sit with for a space of time. And last but not least, another piece of non-fiction, Rainbow Trap by Kevin Guyan. And this is a book that I found really interesting in several ways. So it takes something that doesn't sound particularly sexy or interesting on the face of things, which is data and how that's used for inclusion and for various other things. And it spins something really interesting out of this. So essentially the thesis of the book, I suppose, is that the ways that we collect and use and interpret data often are presented as being a really liberating thing, that we are going to be able to use this to better understand our workforce, to better understand people through dating apps, immigration, all these other things, right? So the idea being that if you are putting in place things to allow people to, for example, seek asylum based on persecution for their sexuality or gender identity in their home countries, the methods that you put in place are a liberatory force, because they are something that allows people to clear through the system and seek asylum. And what this book argues is that some of those things that these institutions then ask for can prove to be a double-edged sword, where sometimes the very strict nature of what might be looked for might itself overlook various forms of someone's identity. So, for example, if somebody doesn't fit into a neat box of proving their sexuality, whether that's because they may be bi, and therefore some of the evidence, quote unquote, that they would be providing would be from a heterosexual relationship, or at least how it's seen externally. And he also looks at things like dating apps, and so the ways that we have been, many dating apps have added extra categories that allow for additional ways of presenting yourself or talking about yourself or thinking about yourself. But actually some of those, by having a physical list of things that you can choose from, that itself complicates things, because you then limit the range of options. But if you have an open box set of options, those can often lead to problems of their own. Those can be weaponized or manipulated badly. And so he basically takes 6 different angles of things. So dating apps, immigration, things like EDI initiatives at work and all those sorts of things, and looks at how sometimes the ways that we think about these things as being incredibly useful might also be quite limiting in other ways, because they essentially prescribe a certain set of identities that are the allowable ones that you can measure, or that you will be looking at everything through. He gives the example of an LGBT workplace index that's fairly popular in the UK, and how that has really beneficial things, but also can be used for a company to, for example, say, well, there's been a complaint about homophobia, but that can't be us because we're the number 2 company in the world, in the UK, for LGBT inclusion. And so this book talks about a lot of those weird edge cases or tricky moments that come up through data. And again, that doesn't sound like it would be that interesting on the face of it, of sort of data and inclusion and how that works together. the nerdy part of my brain was very tickled by this, but also I think there's something very interesting and profound in this book as well, that we can't just leave it to be data-led, or it can't just be policy-led. This has to be something deeper, and I think that's what the book is really getting at, and what I found really interesting about what the book was doing. And it's particularly very well researched, and does a lot of interesting things as well. So those are the books I've been reading this week. There we go. And I hope you're having a good week. I'm sort of still reading Book of Things around it. I'm getting quite close to the end of reading the 2025 long list. So those reviews will be coming as I go. But I hope you're keeping really well. I hope you're having a good week. It is slightly miserable weather here as I speak. But take care, and speak to you all very soon. Bye-bye.